Thank you, and thank you, Samira, and I'm so grateful to the three speakers for coming a very long way to campaign for abolition of the sex trade and for supporting this project from the beginning. All three women feature in the book, and I'm very proud to be working alongside them. I'm going to read an extract from one of the chapters, the abolitionist movement. And I'll just actually turn off my mobile phone, shall I? And I'm going to read for about 10 minutes. But just briefly, a little bit of history of why I started to research this book. It would seem that as a feminist campaigner against male sexual violence towards women and girls, everywhere I went where people weren't in either camp of pro-blanket decriminalisation or abolition of the sex trade, had a very strong opinion of what we should do about the problems pertaining to prostitution. And the vast majority of people you would ask, who knew barely anything about it, had a view that you should, quote, legalise it, make it safer for the girls, quote. Okay? So that was always the default position. And I realised that there was a strong, powerful lobby of self-interested pimps and exploiters behind this message, but there were also extremely genuine people who themselves were in prostitution and who thought that this solution would work, despite the fact that we have had for decades evidence, irrefutable evidence, that decriminalisation and its very close cousin, legalisation, were complete disasters. We've had this from the Netherlands, from Germany, from Nevada in the US, excuse me, from some states in Australia, and from New Zealand. So that was why I decided to take a really close look at how prostitution has been pimped. It's like pimp my ride, pimp my coffee, pimp my trainers. It has been rebranded, remarketed, represented as something that is anything but the wide-scale, wholesale abuse of the most marginalised women and girls and some men and boys in the world. So this chapter starts with a quote from my late friend Andrea Dworkin, who once mused, "Surely the freedom of women must mean more to us than the freedom of pimps." Well, she said this, but she knew that to many, prostituted women do not matter at all. In this chapter, I chart the growth of an exciting and vibrant abolitionist movement. It's a movement with many obstacles to overcome, and I outline the barriers and hostility its members face from the sex trade apologists. It will document the true face behind the international campaign to deregulate an abusive and dangerous trade. It asks why the liberal left is so supportive of the sex trade, when it's a trade built on inequality and the disenfranchisement of the world's poorest and most vulnerable women and children. Through the voices of survivors and other feminist abolitionists from numerous countries and states, you will hear about the ordinary, everyday, common practices and experiences of prostitution, and the reasons why prostitution and the entire global sex trade must be abolished before women can live as equal citizens in this world. The abolitionist movement began in 1860 when Josephine Butler, a social reformer, feminist activist, saw the plight of young homeless girls and women being sold to men for sex. Butler was appalled. As a child, she'd learned about social injustice from her father, John Gray, who was a supporter of the abolition of slavery. Butler's main achievement was her successful campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Act, a brutal piece of legislation that permitted police to round up women in military towns whom they believed to be involved in prostitution in order to test them for venereal diseases. Some women were locked up in hospitals for 3 months until they were cured. Butler said that these acts removed every guarantee of personal security that the law had established, and questioned why it was women who were tested, when in fact it was women who were the victims. And it was men who were the, quote, cause of the vice and its dreadful consequences, unquote. Butler was ahead of her time in that she firmly placed the blame for the abuse of women in prostitution and for the existence of the sex trade on the shoulders of men, something that many feminists today are reluctant to do. Butler was clear that prostitution was male sexual slavery of women, and she attacked the pimps and the profiteers, as well as the state that allowed the sex trade to flourish, yet also blamed the women for the spread of sexually transmitted infections. Does this work? Butler has been accused, can you still hear? Butler has been accused of anti-sex Christian moralism and written off as a rescuer and patronising to working-class women. In reality, Butler was an important figure who advocated on behalf of prostituted women, whom much of society considered to be worthless and scum. Not only did Butler take women into her home when they were in the direst need, but she also challenged men's right to sexual access to prostituted women and children. Butler was clear that prostitution hinders women's human rights and that men are to blame for the existence of prostitution. The abolitionists of today stand on Josephine Butler's shoulders and are, in turn, accused by the sex workers' rights lobby and advocates of decriminalising pimping of being moralistic, anti-sex man-haters. The feminist abolitionist movement is made up of many survivors of prostitution and other forms of male violence, as well as some women and men who recognise the harm the sex trade causes to wider society. What is clear is that the abolitionist movement is global and it is growing. Despite the lack of funding and support the movement receives compared to the pro-prostitution lobby, which is awash with money that supposedly is there to curb the rise of HIV and AIDS, the abolitionist movement is gaining ground and finally being taken seriously by a number of policy and lawmakers around the world. As the evidence continues to mount on the disaster caused by legalisation and decriminalisation, so do the benefits and successes of the abolitionist model, also known as the Nordic model, but has now spread its tentacles into countries such as France and Northern Ireland and Ireland. This legislation was first introduced in Sweden in 1999, and it criminalises paying for sex and decriminalises the selling of sex. Although the Academy is dominated by pro-prostitution scholars and doctoral students, a number of brave and robust academics across various countries and disciplines are daring to carry out and publish credible research on the negative consequences of prostitution and of legal prostitution systems. And of course, this movement is involved, it is part of the global campaign to end men's violence and abuse of women and girls. And I want to just read you a quote now from a woman called Evelina Giobbi, who is the founder of the US abolitionist, the sex trade abolitionist movement, modern abolitionist movement. She said to me in an interview, "The other side were claiming prostitution is not all about violence, and it can be very empowering for women, and certainly a better job than working at McDonald's. So I said to them, well, at least when you work at McDonald's, you're not the meat." Doesn't that just say it all? And I'm sure Sabrina, when she speaks, might give you a little example of how she convinced some pro-decriminalisation student in a debate recently by using the analogy of McDonald's. Maybe I've put you on the spot, Sabrina, but it was so perfect. Abolitionists argued that the only effective way to tackle any trade that's built on vulnerability, exploitation and desperation is to support those desperate enough to sell sexual access to themselves and ensure that those creating the demand pay the price. There is little room for pimps to be reclassified as respectable businessmen, which they are under the New Zealand model, where the sex trade is decriminalised, as there is for police officers to consider it a mere perk of the job to have sex while investigating activities in a brothel. Evelina Giobbi again. I started talking about the similarities between the left and right. They both want control over and access to women's bodies. The right wing does it through marriage, and the left wing does it through prostitution and pornography. You can marry it, you can buy it, and wear it. Evelina founded Women Hurting Systems of Prostitution, Whisper, which I'll speak a little bit about in a minute. There is a cost to those survivors who name prostitution as male violence towards women. Prostitution is not some unusual but generally harmless activity, such as collecting rare insects or mountain climbing, as much of the left would have it. Rather, it's both a cause and a consequence of women's oppression, situated firmly within the patriarchy. Women have long been punished for naming male violence and for insisting we examine and campaign against it as something institutionalised and normalised, instead of seeing it as actions of individual, atypical men. Nowhere is the conflation of sexual desire and sexual abuse more prevalent than in debates on prostitution. Abolitionists are routinely accused by the pro-prostitution lobby of hating men, sex, orgasms, and the female body. And let me just tell you a little bit about the history of Whisper, founded in 1985, as a direct challenge to the notion that prostitution is either a free choice or labour. And we go back to Evelina Giobbi again. I'm 65 years old. I was literally sold into prostitution. It's called trafficking now. I was sold to a pimp as a 14-year-old kid that ran away from home. I was gone for 2 days. Kids who run away from home are not thinking their whole lives. They're just escaping a moment in time. A man was very nice to me and listened to my sad story. He said, I had to meet a friend of his. He took me to the man's house. I was really an innocent, and the man who brought me there left. The other man said, "You're mine. I bought you, and you're going to be a prostitute." I looked at him whatever that word is I now can't pronounce. Yes. And I said no, and turned around to leave, and he beat me half to death, and that was the beginning. And had Giobbi not gone to a Women Against Pornography meeting in 1985 in New York, the modern abolitionist movement might have taken rather longer to garner full support. The sex workers' rights movement, as they described themselves, was already in full swing. Oh my God, they were everywhere, says Giobbi. The big push was Margot St. James of Coyote, a pro-prostitution lobby group founded in the USA in 1973, standing for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. They were the first and last word on prostitution anywhere. Literally, their arguments, word for word, says Giobbi, is exactly what you're hearing from Amnesty International and the pro-prostitution lobby today. Giobbi describes the panel session at the conference that was made up of pro-sadism and masochism and prostitution activists, and also Women Against Pornography members, so you can imagine the atmosphere in the hall. Giobbi says the audience were like the bride side of the family and the groom side of the family, she said. There were the liberals, and there were the leathered-out S&M girls, and there were the feminists, like regular people. I was looking for a seat, but I was wearing a sharp leather jacket and had a very sharp haircut. So they saw me, thought I was one of them. These women are making room for me to sit down on the pro-prostitution side of the hall. And Giobbi continues, someone was going on and on about the whole argument for blanket decriminalisation of the sex trade and saying prostitution's a job. And finally I raised my hand and the chair called on me to speak. I got up and just said, "That's a total lie. I was in prostitution and that's not true." Everyone who knew me looked at me and was stunned. No one had any idea that this woman from Queens, this housewife, had been in prostitution. And Whisper was born. And the hostility from the sex workers' rights activists began immediately when Whisper was founded. And every conference that Evelina Giobbi and her colleagues attended, the pro-prostitution lobby were there, and somebody changed the name to Whimper, saying that they were always complaining about terrible things that had happened to them. Evelina actually thought that this was quite a funny joke, but still took offence at it. And the whimper slur is a typical one used against feminists who campaign to end male violence. You know, moaning, stop complaining, give us a smile. We're accused of creating a victim mentality and inventing or exaggerating the prevalence and effects of sexual abuse. Laura Agustin, a pro-prostitution activist and author of Sex at the Margins, which is a classic trafficking denial text in my view, claims that victims become passive receptacles and mute sufferers who must be saved, and helpers become saviours, a colonialist operation warned against in discussions of Western feminists' treatment of third world women, and now common in discussions of migrant women who sell sex. However, the movement continued to thrive. Am I at 3 minutes yet?
Yeah, absolutely. It's your book launch. I mean.
No, it's fine. It's fine. The movement continued to thrive, and it began to thrive in a number of countries around the world. And it is now a truly global movement. And we can see this from the legislation, the very forward-thinking, progressive legislation that now looks at how to abolish the sex trade and not somehow curtail it and make it available to men who can't keep it in their zippers. So it's now a force to be reckoned with, and I think that we're making really good inroads. And this is because of the survivor-led abolitionist movement. And it's exactly the same as all movements in this country and elsewhere in the world that deals with men's sexual violence. It's the women who have experienced the violence, then speak out and fight against it, who've built this movement. Without question, the most exciting thing to happen in decades within the fight to abolish the sex trade is the survivor-led abolitionist movement, Space International. And if you haven't already looked at its website, please do. Our 3 speakers are all members of Space International, representing their countries. And it's a truly amazing organisation and suffers the slings and arrows from the pro-prostitution lobby. It's quite unbelievable. I've been with the women who represent Space as survivors and heard the things said about them. And one of the founders, Rachel Moran, who wrote a great book, paid for, My Journey Through Prostitution, who has the absolute cheek to not be here tonight because she's at her own book launch in Italy, really was truly visionary and utopian, thinking that this could be a global movement to end the sex trade. And this is what we all have to be. And Fiona Broadfoot, who's in the audience, is the founder of the modern UK sex trade abolitionist movement. I don't know where you are, Fiona, but she gave me a lovely present earlier with "fuck off" written on a teacup that she's at. And Fiona Broadfoot really is to thank for the existence of a wonderful, amazing movement in the UK. The work that Fiona did when I met her, when I first started focusing almost solely on the abolition of the sex trade in my feminist activism, was doing this work on her own. She was helping women exit. She was a speaker at the Curb Crawler re-education programme that we ran in Leeds in 1999. She stood in front of those Johns and made them wish that they'd actually gone to prison rather than be in that John school. She has supported hundreds and hundreds of women and girls, and she's now the founder of Build a Girl, which you have to keep an eye on, because Fiona truly has built this movement in the UK. Thank you.